In today's episode, Jim asks, we've actually gotten pushback internally for using Google Analytics because of data privacy. Have you ever come across this? Yes, plenty of times. There are situations where Google Analytics does not meet regulatory requirements for data privacy, data security, things like that. For the average business, as long as you've implemented it correctly, it's fine. For businesses that require an ISO certification, like ISO 27001, which is a cybersecurity standard, Google Analytics is fine. For situations where you have sensitive personal information or protected health information, for example, Google Analytics is not fine. And the reason for this is that there's no way that you can prove the compliance to some of those standards with Google as the data processor and the data living on remote servers that you don't have control over. And that is and remains one of the biggest challenges for organizations that want to be able to use web analytics in a highly sensitive environment. Generally speaking, a big part of compliance issues with Google Analytics in general is implementation. If you are inadvertently passing protected information of any kind, even if it's just personally identifiable information, you are creating a data security problem. And you are also technically violating the terms of service for Google Analytics itself. One of the prohibitions for using the software is that you do not attempt to store any personally identifiable information within Google Analytics. So, no email addresses, no names, no social security numbers, nothing that would create essentially a legal hazard for Google, as well as your organization. Those things cannot be stored in there. So a big part for all organizations is making sure that you have implemented it and audited it on a regular and frequent basis to make sure you're not pushing data in there that contains that information. The biggest culprit are forms that do not use the HTTP post protocol. There's two protocols with forms, GET and POST. GET puts the data from the form into the URL of a form, and then that gets processed on your website somewhere. POST puts it in a different mechanism that is not the URL. And when you put personally identifiable information in the URL of the site, by default, you are putting it into Google Analytics, and that's where a lot of the trouble happens when you're talking about getting data in there. Now, there are other ways to put data into Google Analytics, the measurement API, the measurement protocol, the custom dimensions, custom metrics, things like that. But those typically require conscious intent. You have to want to do that, to build it into your API calls or to build it into a custom dimension or metric that you set up as a trigger in Google Tag Manager. And so most companies following basic compliance wouldn't do that. Right? It's just not something they would do. Whereas most companies don't necessarily audit their forms to see what mechanism they're sending, and so you can be accidentally sending that data. And so one of the critical things to do if you are using Google Analytics, regardless of your data privacy policies, is to audit your forms, you audit your website, and make sure you're not putting any obvious data into Google Analytics by accident. Now, Google Analytics is not HIPAA compliant. Right? Google says so in the documentation on its website. It does not meet the standard for HIPAA, for the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. As I said, the only certification it has is the ISO 27001, the information security certification. And so if you have higher restrictions, like FERPA, for example, HIPAA, top secret, special compartmented information, you absolutely should not be using Google Analytics for pages that are involved in those environments. Now, if you're in, for example, a healthcare environment, you can have your public website running Google Analytics, right? And then like a patient portal where people log in, that's a place where you don't want to have it running. You want to have a different solution in those cases. Same for finance or education. If you've got regulations like FERPA, for example, that governs education, your college's website can absolutely run Google Analytics, right? Because you should not be collecting personally identifiable information on your public college website. On your student portal, on your academic portal, on your faculty portals. It should not be running there unless you have audited them and made sure they are not passing sensitive information into Google Analytics. Now, if you want to have web analytics in those situations, you need to have something that runs locally on servers that you own and audit and can pass an auditor's test. And then you would run an open source web analytics package that runs on those servers that, obviously, because you own them and you own where the data is stored, you are then in compliance with many of those things. The package that I recommend is an open source package called Matomo. Matomo runs, like I said, locally on a server that you set up and designate and run. And it can be tuned to be however strict or lenient you want it to be with the collection of data. But in those environments where you have, user data, PII, SPI, PHI, that's the kind of software you want to run. You want to make sure that they are kept separate, that you don't use the same tag manager containers. In fact, for servers that run sensitive information, I would not use tag manager at all. I would use Matomo has a version of its own tag manager that, again, runs on a server that you control. And keep those things separate. You'll have to build separate reporting. You'll have to go through the hoops of keeping those systems totally separated. But in doing so, you're meeting the compliance requirements, as long as the server you're running it on, of course, meets those compliance requirements as well. So Matomo on a locally run server will get you web analytics without running into the data privacy issues. Now, for organizations that don't meet those regulatory requirements, that don't have those regulatory requirements, they are not HIPAA organizations, they're not healthcare or education or finance, and you're just getting pushback internally, a big part of that, again, goes to configuration and setup and doing audits. And if you can demonstrate to your stakeholders, yeah, we've done an audit, we've validated that we're not sending any data to Google that we shouldn't be, then I think you can make a pretty strong case that it's fine to use in those situations where you're not going to be collecting sensitive data. But it's really important to do that audit. There are any number of very straightforward techniques to do that kind of auditing. A lot of it involves, if you've got Google Analytics already running, just looking through the data you're collecting, as well as being on the website itself and measuring to make sure that forms behave properly, that you can't see something obvious in the URL. Like, oh, look, there's my name. I just submitted to the form. That's a pretty clear indicator that you're not doing something correctly. But it's a good question. It's an important discussion because not enough organizations think about privacy. Not enough organizations think about data privacy and where the data lives and what data we're sending and to whom. So some good questions. What I would do is contact your legal counsel and get a list of what you are required to comply with, and then use that to decide, can I make Google Analytics do this, or is this something that Google Analytics simply cannot do? And if the latter is the case, then you have to use a different solution. You got follow-up questions? Leave them in the comments box below. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and the newsletter. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Want help solving your company's data, analytics, and digital marketing problems? Visit trustinsights.ai today and let us know how we can help you.